All right, this is going to be literature review parts 3 and 4. So, where I left you off last time, I was brainstorming a literature review, which is like an overview of the research that's already been done on a topic. And the idea is for it to be somewhat comprehensive, but you're trying to build towards like an argument that you're making, or you're setting the groundwork for research that will follow. But for this activity, it's just the literature review by itself. But maybe I'll talk a little bit later about what sort of research I might build on top of this background literature review. So I have my notes from my brainstorming, how I had a couple of ideas, and the ones that I decided not to pursue, and then the ones that I decided to pursue. Throughout all of this, I haven't used AI. It's just not part of my process. I will use AI to do the same project in a later video because I'm curious to see what it does well and what it does poorly. I suspect I'm going to get frustrated trying to use it because it always kind of produces the same general ideas. And as we saw last time, if you watched the earlier video when I was trying to find resources, like Google searches and the DuckDuckGo like web searches just produced the same stuff over and over again, even though that's not what I was asking for. But anyway, I had some resources that I found, and you'll remember if you watched my second video that I found 4 peer-reviewed academic sources. And I have those here. And I mentioned that I wanted 6, at least 6. That's the kind of the basic assignment that I've given my undergraduate students. But I only came up with 4, and I sort of ran into a wall. But that's fine because I knew that more sources would come as I started writing up my review. And I'm going to talk you through what happened. I have now written that review. I've found like 6 more sources, I think. Or it might be up to 9, so 5 more sources. And they're all organized around a general idea. My eyes are a little glassy because I just spent the last 2 hours doing this, and I didn't want to record the video right away, but I'm worried that if I don't do it now, I'll be too far removed from the process to kind of have helpful examples of what happened. So I've already talked through this stuff, so those are the resources and the process that I followed in collecting those resources. So what I did since then is I outlined my manuscript, which I did by reading through those resources. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about those steps that I followed and how I gathered this data. Or I gathered this information. So I've been doing this since I wrote my probably my master's thesis. So going back to like 2011, this is a process that I follow. So you'll see a bunch of like quotes that I've pulled directly out of these writings, other quotes that were given from other sources. Occasionally I will put the bibliographical reference information, or I just kind of note where the reference is coming from so I can do the bibliography later. But just a bunch of little like tidbits that I pulled out of these articles. So I glanced through them. I'll walk you through the steps that I followed. But I'm just collecting information and I'm trying to put it together, and later I'll organize it. So this is just like the very first step. I'm reading with the topic of, if you remember, what would happen to general education at colleges and universities. These are the basic classes that all students have to take. What would happen if the curriculum design and program improvement strategies came from students, or students were consulted in the process? And you'll remember I couldn't find any examples of that, and I started to get frustrated. I have since found a lot of really interesting examples, and I've designed a literature review around it. Now, it didn't take the form that I expected because that's not the information that I found. The information sort of told me how to best organize it, so I'll walk you through that process. So that gives you an idea of what some of those resources were and what I got from them. But let me walk you through the steps. So you might remember that I was on our university library website, and I forgot my login information. Well, I found the login information, and I got a copy of this book. I have the whole book that's available in this online e-reader, but I was also able to download. My university allows me to download up to, I think, 40% of an entire book. Let me see if I can move this to the side and make this smaller. All right, here we go. So I just downloaded the first 25 pages. Oh, that's the wrong book. I just downloaded the first 25 pages, which has like the cover page, the table of contents, the introduction, and the first half of the first chapter. And all I was trying to do, so this was the very first document that I read, I wanted to know, what is the editor trying to do? So there's an editor who gathers essays written by other authors, and those are seen here, so different chapters. And the editor was a co-author on a lot of those chapters. But I jumped straight to the introduction, and I'll show you that I used the highlighter whenever I came across something that was interesting. So from the very beginning, the editor starts explaining the motivation for doing this book. And again, the book is organized around how can we give voice to our students for whom we're organizing our teaching and learning practices. So the first paragraph, I pulled 3 quotes from it because here the author explains exactly what they're doing, why, and where the rationale was coming from, where the motivation was coming from. So note, I have 2 direct quotes from the editor and a quote from someone who inspired the editor. So that's 2 references right away, so 2 different sources and 3 different quotes. And I pulled all of those and I put them in this document. So notice recorded information and quotes from sources. Here's the book, and here are those 3 quotes. I just pulled them straight out and I put them in my outline, and I plan on, they really spoke to me. Like they seem really important, and so I'm going to include them somehow. You'll see how in a little bit. Plus, here's the bibliographical reference. I looked that one up in the notes of this chapter, this introduction. So I kept reading that a little bit, but I got the sense, well, it's actually a very short introduction, brief motivation, and then a chapter outline. So I went through and looked at which chapters I was most interested in. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here because it wasn't as easy as just reading these summaries because the summaries were incomplete. So I had to go and actually find what happened in each of these chapters. So for example, in chapter 1, these 2 authors looked at what characterizes good teaching, and specifically, do students agree with teachers about what qualifies as good teaching? What an interesting question. Teachers are always asked about what qualifies as good teaching. Administrators are asked. Specialists in education are asked. But how often are students asked? Well, in this study, it's clear. So chapter 1, these researchers compared student perceptions of good teachers with what the standards for good teaching are. And they said they were mostly congruent with what students deemed to be the qualities of a good teacher. However, see, this doesn't even say it. So in the chapter description, the overview, all we hear is that the researchers were comparing what teachers and students think qualifies as good teaching. So I wasn't going to say people have looked at this comparison. I wanted to know what they actually found. So I had to go to, I first went to this chapter because I had the first part of it. So here's chapter 1, what makes a good teacher, and results show agreements on communicative, technical, and socio-emotional skills as relevant parameters of quality teaching. However, they differ starkly with respect to the relevance assigned to each. So there's some difference between what students perceive as quality teaching and what the standards say is quality teaching. But they don't even tell us in the abstract. I had to go find it in the chapter. And if I scrolled all the way down, they're just describing context. And at the very end of what was available and what I downloaded here, the first 25 pages, they just start to get to the data. So I had to go to the website, This is a library website, and I had to open up the rest of the study. So I picked it up where it left off, which was this table here. Well, actually, a whole bunch of tables. And then I just kind of skipped to the discussion because I wanted to know what were the takeaways. Yeah, so here we go. More specifically, our study proposes a triad of teacher qualities, blah, blah, blah. However, there's one major difference: how these skills are distributed and prioritized. Students underscore the role of socio-emotional aspects, followed by communicative and technical ones. So right there, students think the social emotional skills are the most important. And if I remember, it was like 43%, because I looked through it. So that already tells me more than I got from those little brief sort of overviews. And then I picked, I think it was all from this paragraph right here. I picked one specific example. So I looked at socio-emotional. And, well, you can read about it in my literature review later. I'm not going to spend all my time talking you through that process. So I wasn't able to get that, unfortunately, from the chapter summary here. Boy, would that have been convenient. I had to actually go look it up. So I want you to keep in mind that you might be able to read a summary of a chapter, or in this case, or an article, or in this case, a chapter. But the summary might be too vague. If I just stayed here, what are the parameters of quality teaching, and do students agree with what the standards are for teachers? That doesn't tell me what the disagreement was, and even if there was a disagreement. So I had to go to that source specifically and look for it. And that was the theme with all of these. Thankfully, I had a copy of the book right here, and I could go look them up. So I had to read this chapter directly and this chapter directly. This one, I think, was enough information for me to write that part of the lit review. So that tells you or shows you a little bit of my process. So let me go back to my notes. So notice I wrote in here, do students agree with teachers on what qualifies as good teaching? And when I wrote that up, I had to go look for that information. So to here, and then I think I pulled this one out and didn't end up using it. So that was just the very first resource, that first book. And I already have one, the book itself, this quote, so another resource, and then 3 chapters. That's 5 resources in the first book that I found. So I'm quoting from or referencing 5 sources already. And here's a little bit of how I outlined that. Now moving on, I had 4 resources, so I went through all of them. The next one was this Perceptions of Healthcare Design. That turned out to be not very interesting, so I wrote a very tiny bit there. I have the USG General Education Curriculum. I didn't even look at that because I was just using it as an example. And I know it. I use it regularly for the last 6 years. And then this book, General Education Essentials. And I looked at the very first chapter of that, which you will see here. And all I did was looked at, all right, what is this book organized around? So general education, what do faculty need to know about gen ed? Okay, it's this distribution versus integration. How does he define those? Well, students aren't consulted. That's all I'm really interested in. I want to use it as an example. And when students are consulted, they're not actually consulted directly. So when we look at how students feel about gen ed, we just imagine what it would be like as, middle-aged men and women, what it would be like to be like a Gen Z or Gen Alpha student who's just getting started. And so, of course, it's not going to track exactly onto what students actually think, what they actually experience. We need to engage that directly. So I just use that as an example. Back to my process. I started this outline. I put this outline together, pulled out information that I liked. I started to pull out my bibliographical information. By the way, the book that I have through my library for free was published in 2012, but I looked online and he has a second edition that came out in 2024, and that's the one I include in my bibliography because I don't actually use a direct quote. I'll have to look. If I do, I may need to attribute that to the 2012 edition. Once I have the outline information, I build my my review. So I've reorganized the information into an outline. It's just kind of all over the place up here. And so I have one paragraph or one section talking about the problem that I'm going to address. And then that problem is missing the student's perspective. And I'll use the examples of that book and the USG website. And then I'll have a section about what research might include if students are included. And so I've got those 3 chapters, the book, and then that other reference, and that information's all there, just one after the other. You'll see how I put that in lit review form. Then I have this medical or healthcare text example. This one I didn't end up using because I started to get tired of writing, and I didn't think a 5th example was going to be necessary. Okay, and then eventually I want to, or at the end I want to have some sort of conclusion where I point the way forward, so some sort of kind of summary. Then I actually wrote the manuscript, and the hard work was done. I just needed to connect the ideas, and I ended up writing in about, I guess, 45 minutes, and the bibliography there, 1,500 words, so it's not very long. 1, 2, 3, about 4 single-space pages, so like 8 pages there. I could develop the introduction and conclusion a little bit more, I think. But notice, these are all the bullet points that I shared in that earlier outline. The introduction, so here's the problem. I explain what gen ed is and how students are missing. Then I go into detail about missing students. So I just have, notice I have headings for everything. So the introduction, that's what's covered there. And then the first main point, which is general education ignores students' perspective. And then I have 2 examples there. Decisions are made away from campus and students are ignored from course design and assessment. And I've got the examples that I've already talked about. And I found a way to work in my own book. So I cited myself there, a little tip for Burge-winning academics who want to build their citations. So the problems, missing students, and then the next section, what happens when students are included. And so I've got the healthcare education example. That was the WHO et al. Study that wasn't very interesting in my opinion, but it provided a good example. And I had to look at the design of that to understand what was done. But that was very simple. It was very straightforward. Most of the information was available in the abstract except for the questions that were asked and how it was analyzed, how the results were analyzed. Then I jumped to the book, Student Focused Research and Education Programming, and then each section is a different chapter. I talk about a study done in a different chapter. So 1, 2, 3. And then my conclusion, I was very tired, and so I only wrote about 3 sentences. I would probably want to triple that if I wanted this to be balanced. And so just a note about balance. When you look at your finished literature review, there should be equal attention paid to each section. And if any section gets the most attention, it should be the most important. So the introduction is 3 paragraphs. The first section is about the same volume. The first subsection is about the same volume. Each section is about, 3, 4 paragraphs. I have a little introduction to the most important section. So the problem statement is 3/4 of a page. The solutions to the problem, that's the most. It's probably 2 pages. But each section is about as long as the other ones. They get shorter as my examples drag on because I expect the reader to draw similar conclusions for each of these, so I don't need to spend as much time on them. So all of this kind of contributes to the balance. So the reader knows how important something is by how much time I spend on it, and the organization it sets the reader up to sort of anticipate what the next section is going to be talking about. If they complement each other, then they're all part of the same subsection, or they're subsections within a bigger section, and so on. And then the one thing that stands out to me is unbalanced is a very short conclusion. I would probably want to see a discussion section where I do this that's twice as long at least, and then a conclusion that maybe talks about some of the shortcomings of my review here, what I would like to have included but didn't, and so on. And then my references. Once you've been doing APA references for 20 years, they come very easily, but you can use, I think, like a citation generator if you need to. But that's it. That's the whole lit review. So I've walked through 2 steps of that process, and I think it's important to keep them separated, because if you just start with your paper, so you just start with like the manuscript, that's overwhelming. So I did 2 steps before that. I had a step where I just pulled out information that was interesting to me. Then I organized the information into an outline. Notice the numbers and headings. And then once the outline's there, if you don't want to get a blank sheet of paper and start writing, just fill the outline in. Pretty soon you'll have like 2,000 words in your outline. You just remove the numbers and you've got your paper. But that should wrap up at least the student created, or like the professor created, literature review. Next, probably not today because there's not much left cognitively, I'll show how much AI would speed this process up or slow it down. I'm honestly not sure if it would be better or worse, helpful or unhelpful, but I already have my example, what I generated, to compare it to. So we'll be able to make that comparison at that point.